Good morning to everybody. I welcome all of you for this session. Myself, Professor Neeja Sharma from Barkatullah University, Bhopal. My right side is Dr. Anita Dige. She is ex-director of Campus Open Learning in the University of Delhi. She worked lots of work in the lifelong learning and adult education programs. We all welcome her for her presentation on adult learning and information communication technology.
Well, those of us and all of us here, we know that the national governments of a majority of developing countries have tended to marginalize adult education policies and programs, as well as training of adult education functionaries. Now, a study was undertaken in the year 2002 by the then UNESCO Institute of Education, now known as the UNESCO Institute of Lifelong Learning, which showed that in most countries, despite the fact that there were a large number of adult education functionaries who needed to be trained, only a small percentage got trained. And this was because because of lack of resources, human as well as financial. The training methodology was top-down, was reduced to knowledge transmission, and it did not consider or look at, perceive literacy as multidimensional, or the approaches were not learner-centered and participatory. Also, that the training programs were ad hoc and perfunctory. And as a result of this, there was a tremendous amount of transmission loss. And so it was realized that the adult education functionaries are actually quite ill-equipped to meet the challenges posed by their work. So therefore, it was recommended that there is a need to improve the quality of training that the adult educators receive. And also it was felt that there was need to think of new approaches to training adult education functionaries. Now, I think it's also important for us to look at some of the international initiatives that have influenced the content of adult education training. About 10 years ago, there was the 5th International Conference on Adult Education, Confantia. And Confantia 5 proposed a vision of adult learning, which was an enlarged vision of adult learning, which cut across a variety of sectors and was firmly rooted in a framework of human development and social justice, comprising elements such as democracy, critical citizenship, cultural diversity, social inclusion, human rights, peace, and gender equality. The Hamburg Declaration, which came out of the Confantia 5, reflected a strong commitment to promoting the right to education and learning, and to the creation of a learning society. And then thereafter you had the Dakar conference, which again talked about investing in quality education of children as well as of adults. And then last year, the UNESCO, of course, has played a pivotal role. UNESCO brought out the Global Monitoring Report in 2006, and the report also talks about the creation of a rich and dynamic literate environment. So the international policy discourse, I think it's important for us to take note of these developments, because the international policy discourse does have an impact on the training of adult education functionaries. Now, another development, of course, has been that the conventional mode of training adult education functionaries, as we all know, is inadequate. And now with the rapid development of information and communication technologies, and we have access to the internet and e-learning and virtual classrooms, now there are new opportunities have opened up for training adult education functionaries. It was also felt that we should keep the ODL format, the open and distance learning format, in mind. Unusual approach was that we felt that we should focus, that we should have a participatory approach in the development of this course. Now, keeping the learner center stage, now that is something that is slightly unusual for an ODL program. And to that extent, this is a little different, because it is emphasizing the participatory approach Our focus is on participatory processes, in a sense is making a statement that we do have an ideological bias. It's a very contextual approach because we do feel that contexts are different, contexts vary, and contexts do matter. The role of ICTs in education and development, pitfalls, potential pitfalls and challenges, provides an overview that examines the meaning of ICTs, weighs the strengths and weaknesses of ICTs, examines some of the myths that surround ICTs, and then highlights the lessons that are learned on the use of ICTs to enhance learning. Some work had been done by UNESCO where they had tried to look at the current use of ICTs in literacy programs in E9 countries, and the study showed that that there were problems, that not many countries were really using ICTs for literacy. Now, what are the learning objectives? Basically, to enable the learner to understand the potential and role of ICTs in literacy programs, to highlight the strengths and weaknesses of literacy programs that use ICTs, and to apply the understanding and analysis in selecting and using relevant ICTs in their work as adult educators. One is looking at the context. I mean, it's a rapidly changing world. We are living in a globalized world. The ICTs are bringing about enormous changes. There is certainly much better access to information than ever before. ICTs are making that possible, but the access to technology is uneven, and there was some discussion on this yesterday. And then when you look at the urban and the rural areas, you find that there are certain parts of rural areas that have hardly any access to technology even now. So therefore, we do have a problem of digital divide, and it is women who are affected the most because of this problem, and particularly women in rural areas who are affected most because of the problem of rural divide. Now, why do we want to use ICTs for literacy programs? Well, one is of course the sheer numbers, the vast number of people who are illiterate. We also have a mandate. We have made a commitment, India has been a signatory, that the UN Literacy Decade envisages that the literacy rate would be increased by 50% by the year 2015, and this is a commitment that Government of India has made. Now, with the rapid expansion of ICTs, we need to pay attention to how ICTs can improve the quality of literacy education, and that is why we need to pay some attention to ICTs. Now, what is meant by ICTs? Well, normally we associate ICTs with high-tech devices, but we also need to, and certainly in a country like India as well as other countries in the region, we need to look at the conventional technologies, because these are the technologies that are more accessible and more in use. But ICTs refer to technologies that are used to transmit, create, share or exchange information, and ICTs include radio, television, DVD, telephone, satellite systems, computer, hardware, software, video conferencing, electronic mail, as well as the traditional media, certainly in the case of India. Now, as I mentioned to you that a study had been commissioned by UNESCO, and it was undertaken in 7 of the 9 E9 countries, and these included China, Brazil, Mexico, India, Egypt, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Now, I had an opportunity to look at the country papers, and it was very evident reading the country studies that adult literacy is a neglected area for policymakers and planners in most countries, because the priority has always been given to primary and secondary education. And this was certainly true in India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, because of the massive problem of adult illiteracy. Not enough, we do have a massive problem, but there is not enough commitment or investment in adult literacy programs. So our priorities still remain primary education. They have been so far, and now we are certainly paying much more attention to secondary education. So adult education is still neglected despite the problem. Now, with regard to ICTs, there is the problem of infrastructure. We always have insufficient financial resources. There is a lack of trained manpower, and but this is not to suggest that the ICTs have not been used. So there have been sporadic efforts in the use of ICTs in literacy programs in India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. and the country studies do mention which are the specific initiatives that have been taken up. Now, what are the broad trends in the use of ICTs in literacy programs? Now, one is that most countries do not use ICTs in literacy programs, nor have they formulated policies for integration of ICTs in adult literacy programs. They have problems with regard to financial resources as well as technological infrastructure. But there is one characteristic that is common to all countries. The ICTs that are used are typically basic ones, that is radio and television. And when computers or the internet are involved, they are for restricted or targeted users. A lot of them are basically pilot studies, and there was one that I was also involved in where we used computers for literacy. But again, it was a pilot initiative. Now, but I'm sure things are changing now very fast. There's much greater use of ICTs, particularly in school education. And as far as the adult education and adult illiterates are concerned, what is promoted is basically community learning centers. But the use of ICTs in community learning centers is still very limited. UNESCO has done a lot of work in promoting community learning centers. Most ICT projects for adult literacy are pilot projects, and they're funded by foreign or international agencies. And then the problem, of course, which is a very severe problem, is that of problem of sustainability. The program funding ends, and so does the project end. But my sense is that things are changing, and things are changing very fast. And I think even in the case of India now, there is much greater commitment to use of ICTs. Not much attention across the countries, not much attention has been paid to gender issues, and there is no effort to address issues of access, content, impact of technology insofar as women are concerned, because women are affected the most. So insofar as access is concerned, content, impact of technology, they have really, those studies did not show that kind of sensitivity to gender. Now, lastly, one is looking at what is the Indian experience in using ICTs. And here we have experiences, and some of these were national projects. Khilti Kaliya, for instance, and I think you would remember, this was an initiative of the Directorate of Adult Education. There was a primer for women, and based around the primer, the television programs were developed. And then there was this PRIAL, which is Project in Radio Education and Adult Literacy. Subsequently, Chauraha, which was computer-based. And now in recent years, you have the Tata computer-based literacy program, CBFL, about which I've read that Planning Commission thinks it's a very good initiative. And then, of course, there is the Bridges to the Future initiative, which was a project which was undertaken by the University of Pennsylvania in Andhra Pradesh, and then the Commonwealth of Learning Literacy project, on which I worked myself. And this was in 3 states of India. Now, what is the role of ICTs in literacy program? This is what the UNESCO study is showing, that ICTs do have a role to play in literacy programs. One is that they make learning interesting, and they stimulate learning process. So ICTs can make learning interesting and stimulating. So they do enhance, in that sense, they do enhance learning. The other, of course, is broadening access to literacy education. They help overcome barriers of, various barriers such as the social, cultural, political, geographical, and barriers that exist. So they help overcome those barriers. So access becomes possible. And they do facilitate creation of local content, so they can enable rapid, cost-effective creation and distribution of socially, culturally, and linguistically appropriate learning content. Even our study showed that it was possible for us, even though we were working with state resource centers, to develop locally relevant materials. The ICT certainly promoted that. Professional development of teachers, this is something the ICTs can play a very major role in training teachers, as well as supplementing and supporting their work. And then, of course, creating a literacy-conducive environment. They can make possible production of a variety of materials, written materials, which are necessary for reinforcing or promoting literacy skills. This is the role that the ICTs can play. What are the strategies for using ICTs as a tool for achieving literacy decade goals? On the basis of the experiences thus far, it should be possible, and this is something that one has tried to do, is to extrapolate on the basis of all these experiences. What is it that one could then articulate the strategies for using ICTs for promoting literacy? So what is it that one is saying? One is you have to have a policy. Formulating a policy for integrating ICT in adult literacy. We don't have a policy, and it is important and necessary to have a policy to integrate ICTs in adult literacy programs. The policy, this is not directly linked to this, but it has to do with policy, that there are two approaches. One is the right-based, one is sort of flagging your attention to this, that there has to be rights-based approach to literacy. And also we now must link illiteracy with poverty and have to address the problem of livelihood centrally, because livelihood issues now have become very, very critical. And we all know that illiteracy is linked with poverty. So we need to have that kind of a broad understanding. One is the rights-based approach, and the other is the link with poverty. Now, providing infrastructure and access to technology, that is something that needs to be done. And there is, of course, a very grave danger that the literacy programs are likely to suffer from paucity of financial resources. So one is not suggesting that computers be provided to individual adult learners, but certainly the community learning center as a concept is something that can be promoted, because the CLCs do ensure access to technology. Ensuring community participation through ICT, this is very important, because like any rural development project, ICT projects must ensure sustained community participation, particularly of the poor learners. We found in a study that the location, the place where the ICTs were located, that determined who would come. So for instance, if your ICTs or your learning center was in a part of the village where the rich upper caste people lived, then the poor automatically got left out. Or if it was in a panchayat ghar, women did not come. So therefore, it is very important to involve the community. So besides decisions relating to physical location, which is very important, timing, because that's also something that the poor learners themselves should decide, use of ICTs, poor need to control technology as well as the relevant know-how. So the control is very important. Who controls? Who is taking decisions? And if technology is left in the hands of the poor, and particularly women, there is a better possibility of their using the technology. Developing learner-centered and context-specific ICT tools. We have, in order to reach the unreached, and which I think is our goal in adult education, we have to address their diverse needs, and therefore we have to create a whole variety of materials, which is something that ICTs do make possible, creation of such materials. ICTs can be used to arouse interest and enthusiasm and engage learners in their use. Developing useful and relevant content, again flowing from that. ICT projects must address the local needs of various kinds, and the neoliterate adults can use such information to improve their lives, and this again is something that is feasible and possible. Ensuring professional development of literacy personnel. Now, we all know that this is how I started, that training is generally neglected. ICTs can help in the professional development of literacy personnel. Research and monitoring is very important, and they have to be built into program design. So you have to build research, monitoring and evaluation into program design, and here universities and research organizations can play a very important role. We need partnerships. The next point, which is ensuring multi-stakeholder partnerships. Now, since ICT projects require huge financial investments, it is possible that the claims of the poor to participate in information economy might get shortchanged. There is a very real danger that you might just bypass them, because the school system does make very heavy demands, and so there is a possibility that the governments our national governments might allocate resources for the school programs, but as far as adult education programs, that the poor might get shortchanged. So partnerships between government, NGOs, private sector are necessary. But this is a tricky proposition, because one is not saying bring in the private sector. No, because the government has a role to play. And it is necessary to leverage respective strengths. Each player has some strength or the other, and it is important to leverage the strengths of each player. And lastly, ensuring sustainability of ICT-based literacy programs, because this is a very serious problem, is sustainability. How do you sustain ICT-based projects? Now, it is said that make it commercially viable. There is debate on this whole issue, because once you talk about commercial viability, you find that the poor do get left out. So there is always that danger. But community involvement is still very essential for sustainability. And all said and done, the bottom line is that government commitment and government funding is still very essential. And that government funding has to be provided on a sustainable basis. It cannot be project-based funding.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dege, for your so many things and so many points about the ICTs. I welcome your comments and suggestions.
In the light of globalized world and private partnerships in the field of literacy, what should be the slant or stand an ordinary adult literacy worker like us should follow?
I am in doubtful condition whether email and this methodology, will it be possible for us to use in the tribal areas and in the interior areas where the persons are not in a position to reach there?
As we have experienced in our place in Northeast, particularly for the rural people in the rural areas, we find that practically it is very difficult to draw the attentions of the rural people, particularly for the involvement of the people in participatory developmental programs, particularly on ICT. So what approaches we should apply, for the people in the rural areas to draw the attention on the involvement of participatory developmental program? Thank you.
The problems which you are thinking as great are really not that great. We are afraid that we can't use email, we don't have computer, all that. What is needed? All these things can be put in a CD, and one can carry a CD player. Whenever talking, CD player is not a very big thing. CD player and a screen. With that, whatever is there, they can be very easily taught, and the villagers, when they see the CD player and all, in many cases it might be a new thing for them. Just you carry a CD player, take a CD, no need of email, no need of computer, no need of internet, you can easily show it to them.
In an ideal condition, we have computers, we have CDs, we have DCDs, we are using ICTs somehow, maybe we are taking corporate social responsibilities help or something. Can we do away with the human factor?
We have run a pilot project in one of our districts, Jalna. There we found it that it can be a very much attraction point for the new literate. So it is very, very useful. But local level problems are much, and it needs government policy and commitment.
Last one.
You have focused on ensuring community participation through ICT, but how this can be made possible?
A lot of questions have been raised, and I'm not sure if I'm going to be answering all of them, but starting with the first one, the ideological slant. Yes, there is an ideological slant. When you go back to the genesis of participatory research, which goes back to the 70s, that's exactly what they were saying, is that so far, and particularly the social science research, talked about being very apolitical, being very objective. What are the norms? The research had to be very objective, it had to be unbiased, there were the validity norms and so on. And participatory research questioned all of that and said that no, research is extremely ideological, is biased, and it will determine whose perspective, because eventually you are presenting somebody's perspective in terms of the way you design your questionnaire, in terms of the way you collect your data, in terms of the way you analyze and you present your findings. It was in the 70s that the whole question was raised about the ideological bias of social science research as well, and certainly Freire did tell us that, you know, we have to be very clear as to whose side are we on, and that is the ideological slant or the bias that we're talking about. Now, in terms of the global economy and what it is, a globalized world that we live in, that is precisely the danger, because it is the poor who will get left out. It is the poor who will have no access to not only technology, to resources, and so therefore it is extremely important that we take a clear stand, and we are very clear that we are going to work with the poor. Now, in terms of community participation, how do we do it? Two questions have been raised on. I don't think I can tell you in 2 minutes or 1 minute, because I think that itself would require a lecture. There is enough expertise in this country. There are people who know how to do it. They encourage community participation. There are ways and means of doing it. It's just a matter of commitment. Are you really committed? And I think as adult educators, you should be committed, you know. And so if you are, you will not start with a program, because that's something that will come later. You will start with finding out what is it that the people want. The problem is that we don't even listen to what people are saying. So therefore, community participation is possible. There are enough examples in this country from which we can learn as to how it can be done. So therefore, it is possible. Now, in terms of the use of technology, one is not suggesting that we bring in alien technologies, not at all. You have to start with technologies that are there, and people are using local level technologies, okay? So let us understand, and I even mentioned traditional technologies. I mean, there are you know, people are using, and those of you who've been involved in the TLCs have been using traditional technology. So I'm not even you know, going to talk about it. But let's start from there. But that is not to suggest that we should not get into other technologies as well. And mention was made of radio, community radio. Yes, why not? As I said, the bottom line is participation. And that is something that we need to really pay attention to. It's basically to draw the attention of the policymakers and planners that you must provide resources which are commensurate with the magnitude of the problem. And to that extent, I think this needs to be highlighted. Because if we in adult education do not talk about the magnitude of the problem or the need for resources, who will? I mean, nobody else is going to fight for our cause. So it is, as I said again, it's not to give this impression it is we versus them or school education versus, because it is a larger issue of education, but certainly we are talking as adult educators of the need for resources to be provided, and if it is ICT, well, we're talking about technology to be provided. There is a lot of training that has to happen, and the training again has to be very, very gradual. We talked about community participation. Well, we start, as I mentioned to you, even in terms of the location. Where do you locate? Where do you start if it's a community learning center? Where do you keep those the equipment? And so it is not us who should decide, it is not the functionaries who should decide, and they do it on the basis of convenience, but it is the community members, particularly the poor, particularly the women amongst them. If they take the decision, there is a greater possibility that they will come, they will use, but it's a slow process. Please let me underline this fact, that it is an extremely slow process. You cannot rush, you cannot hurry, but once they begin to understand the potential, once they begin to understand that, that they can really use it, and that I think is what is necessary and important.
Thank you very much for Dr. Dighe and all the participants also. So thank you very much for your cooperation.